Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Cor Ecclesiae. This is our bi-monthly conversation. And this week, Michelle Loris is absent. She's at a meeting in Minnesota. And so it's Dan and Charlie and myself. And you will remember the last time it was the three of us as well, because Charlie was away having a baby. So the important thing now is not only is to talk about birth, but to talk about birth of new ideas and how we move forward on some of the key issues facing the American Church and indeed the Vatican and the Universal Church. So quite an expanse. We've only got 30 minutes. But we're going to start off with the whole continuing issue of immigration. The president in his State of the Union spoke about it last night. There was every indication that it was not departing in any significant way or in any way at all from the policy of deportation that has been characteristic of the current government. But there has been resistance, increasing, mounting resistance from American bishops. And let's start off by talking about that, Dan. You have observed not only with this letter that was forthcoming, but it wasn't signed by all the bishops, only by some. And there was an earlier letter from three cardinals that also addressed, amongst many other things, this ever problematic issue of immigration and the government's handling of that in the U.S. What do you think?
I think it's very significant. I think yesterday's letter, which was sent by a number of bishops from border states,
Mhm.
and seems to have really been pushed in many ways by Archbishop Weissenberger of Detroit, right? A recent appointment um, as Archbishop of Detroit, right? Timed with the State of the Union, is showing the increased volume of attention that the bishops are putting on immigration and trying to bring to the minds of Catholics that this is very important. There have been other bishops who've made statements also, including some who have less of a reputation as Francis or Leo bishops. Bishop Kevin Rose of Fort Wayne, South Bend, made a statement recently. He's also been engaged in some politics from the other direction at the University of Notre Dame there, but he has been taking a stand on immigration. So it's clear that there is a kind of reorienting of the American bishops on this. There was also a statement last week from the USCCB following up on the statement in November, right, from the official USCCB office about this matter. So I think this is significant for a few reasons. One of them is that this is a set of issues where Pope Francis had a very difficult time getting through to the American bishops, whereas Leo, I think, for a few reasons, is having some more success. I think there's really a couple of reasons for that, two or three reasons for that. One um, is I think that Leo is an American, right? They can't accuse him, as he said himself, they can't accuse him of not understanding the country. Second, he's 70 years old. They're expecting him to be there 15 or 20 years, which for most of them is going to be their entire ministry as a bishop. So the kind of wait him out mentality that a lot of American bishops had around Francis is not going to work anymore.
Good point. Good point.
And um, and I also think there's just been enough turnover. Again, Archbishop Weissenberger is a recent appointment. And it's, as we talked about in our last episode, the recent Episcopal appointments in various places have tended toward pastors, away from culture warriors, right? Away from people who kind of got to be a bishop by taking the typical route of kind of kissing up to the bishop that they worked with and who was their ordinary and all that. So I think all of those things are combining to a real kind of shift in the witness of the American church, and one that really couldn't come fast enough. Before I stop, I just want to point out one other thing that came across my desk this morning, which was the great sociologist of religion Ryan Burge released a report indicating that U.S. Catholic support for the death penalty was markedly up. In fact, higher than evangelicals for the first time in decades.
Good.
Um, Giving an indication, right, that there is a need for the bishops to stress the entirety of Catholic social teaching in a way that simply has not been the case for the last 30 years or so.
Yes, I was going to comment on that in terms of the fact that the heavy emphasis on immigration right now is entirely understandable given its urgency and moral immediacy. But there are several other issues in addition to that that the bishop should be concerned about in terms of the direction of the country. Charlie, you want to move in on this?
Yeah, well, Dan brought up a point near the end of his comments that directly relate to what I wanted to say about this letter from the bishops in border states and beyond, which is we're seeing a movement in the church, just as you say, Michael, to address the fact that a lot of these issues are interrelated, and Catholic political discourse for the past couple of decades, especially in the United States, has tried to silo things. One of the arguments that shows up in this letter from the bishops is that the separation of mixed migration families causes harm to children. It's a violation of the natural right of the family, as we understand as a part of the natural law in the Catholic tradition. And that intervention by the bishops starts to align with Pope Leo speaking to the dicastery for life and pointing out that war is a health issue. So we're starting to see an integration of the Catholic idea of the support for life across political realities as having to be integrated. I think Dan's point to see that we're seeing an increase in dialogue here because Pope Leo knows the American church and so is going to be listened to, hopefully. I think that's why there's an amplification of this importance of the immigration crisis in dialogue, not just the fact of immigration enforcement, but the style. The fact that we're seeing such gross violations of human rights and dignity around the United States right now by ICE officers, that point, I think, is one of the ways in which the intervention here is not limited to just one hot button issue, but is actually pointing out that we're witnessing a denigration of dignity. And that's one of the ways in which the church is intervening.
Very good. I wonder if do you think this is a posthumous validation of the Bernardine argument?
I think so. It's one of the points of the seamless garment, and I think we have to get into uh, Dan's put it on the table that there might be increasing support for the death penalty.
Yeah.
But I do think that we're starting to embrace what Pope St. John Paul II called a culture of life in a more nuanced way, not limited just to reproductive issues, sexuality, abortion, children, but actually expanding to think about what does it mean to have a culture of life where the family is not just something to be won, but rather actually something that all members of society are called to support and care for. Immigration is something that points out to us that our most basic unit as creatures is as a family, not necessarily with our national citizen identities.
Mhm. And the biblical injunction to welcome the stranger, of course, which has been an important part of American mythology, right? From the outset, has now been turned on its head. So it does seem to me that an American pope can go a long way to help to right this. This brings up, that was quite surprising. I did not know that fact, Dan, about the rising interest in the death penalty. That's depressing, especially now we have it in the Catechism and elsewhere that the Catholic Church's position is clear. But I want to just move slightly to a somewhat related thing, and that is the whole issue of war and peace. As you know, the President of the United States has established its Board of Peace. Various nations and political entities throughout the world were invited to sit on that board. Most of Europe, Canada certainly, and the Vatican have declined for all kinds of reasons. What struck me was when Cardinal Parolin made it very clear that Pope Leo would not accept a position on the Board of Peace, was that the prior commitment to the UN as the international agency responsible for this remained Vatican policy. But it was once again the rebuke of the Cardinal and the Vatican by a practicing Catholic. The communications director, Levitt, to quote her, she says, she's deeply, the position of the Vatican on this is deeply unfortunate. I don't think that peace should be partisan or political or controversial. And she described the Trump-led initiative to rebuild Gaza as, and I quote, a legitimate organization where there are tens of member countries from around the world. This is a very selective reading, of course. I'm not sure how skilled Levitt is in political policy, but she's certainly skilled on articulating the president's position. Um, did this Was this a particular act of courage on the part of Pope Leo, do you think, or just a politically adroit move, or just an effort to skirt any kind of unnecessary controversy as he ponders when he will come to his native country? What do you think, Dan?
So I think I would also highlight Cardinal Pizzaballa's comments on this, right, which really centered the voices of Palestinians, right, on this matter, and made clear, right, that any board of peace um, run by somebody who uses Palestinian as an epithet, right, is not really going to be peace, right? And that I think yesterday was the fourth anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine, right? And of course, we've also seen Russia be very expert in using peace in a way that doesn't really mean peace, right? So I think there is savvy here on the part of Leo in avoiding becoming part of something that is really a sham, right? And that really has no moral standing, right? And it, as you said, right, it's a reinforcement of the church's commitment going back to the time of Pius XII following World War II, right, to the UN as the proper place for this kind of thing to be carried out, rather than, again, this pretty suspect board, right, where Trump pledged $10 billion that Congress has not appropriated, um, theoretically to go to this board of which he says he's going to be director for life, um, right? I think Leo wants to center the moral witness of the church rather than the realpolitik, right? Of course, there is a place for realpolitik. Right? The church has engaged in concordat diplomacy recently with the People's Republic of China, right? This still goes on. But the Board of Peace is such a sham and such a parody of peace that I think any participation of the Vatican in it, would give it a legitimacy that it does not deserve.
Yeah, I agree. Charlie.
I think Dan's raising a really important point here. I loved your question, Michael, because it got me thinking about savvy in a slightly different way. The Vatican could have declined joining the Board of Peace for two procedural reasons: the veto power of a single head of state butts against Catholic teaching about how we're supposed to think about the nations of the world in cooperation. And the second reason that we've not commented on yet is the ambiguity of the financial obligation of member states. So I think one of the reasons the Vatican might have declined the Board of Peace is simply the fact that the Vatican state does not have the capital or cash right now to contribute to a rebuilding project in Gaza, even if we're speculating an alternative universe where that was a good project with multilateral support across the world, and it included Palestinian buy-in. Simply the structure of the Board of Peace was too ambiguous on what its financial obligations were. And as Dan has rightfully pointed out, some of the pledges from the United States have not yet gone through our even local political processes for appropriating funds. What I think is quite savvy is, rather than coming out with those two very clear objections, which is why a number of commentators, myself included, did not see a yes from Pope Leo to his invitation coming at all for simple political reasons of money and the structure of the board. Instead, it was a clear endorsement of continuity of the church's commitment to the United Nations. And that stands, I think, right now as a real challenge as we think about what is so-called globalization of the 20th century going to look like moving forward after Donald Trump is president of the United States, as we think about major economic changes coming with artificial intelligence and a tech-empowered global marketplace. I do think this endorsement of the UN is going to be exceedingly consequential for seeing that institution as a place for multilateral state dialogue.
I think it is, in fact, that's grave. If you look at the list of the countries that have pledged to provide the billions, which we'll see whether in fact happens, because as we know, a lot of this is just empty rhetoric. The are countries that are either easily intimidated or desperate for American approval or marginalized or whatever. The absence of any significant European power, I think, is illustrative of the problem, of the fact, rather, that this is a sheen, this is a gloss for something very different. And the absence of any Palestinians on it, Pier Battista Pizzaballa, the Latin patriarch, has made that clear. Dan is right to echo his concern on this. So I think but what interests me, and this is a minor point, but what interests me is the fact that this is yet another instance of ostensibly pious Catholics wrapping the knuckles of the Vatican and the papacy. You had Tom Homan, the Homeland Security Czar or whatever, telling the Vatican to get its act in order and to leave the United States alone on some of its immigration policies because they need to look at their own backyard, right? This is a strange posturing and position by ostensibly conservative Catholics who would have attacked previous administrations for being insufficiently sympathetic to Vatican initiatives. So there is an interesting irony around this that continues to play itself out with dramatic comedy. Anyway, on another front, not so comic, but persistently tragic, if not ironic, is the revival of the Society for St. Pius X. The society didn't disappear. I mean, it was created in 1970, as you know, after the council by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, a Swiss missionary who was really unhappy with the council and many of its documents, particularly Dignitatis Humanae and Nostra Aetate, but pretty well the liturgy document as well, of course. Over the decades, the Vatican's attempted to negotiate with him. John Paul II did for the longest time, and then, of course, in the 1980s, when Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops, this was the breaking point. Benedict XVI reopened negotiations. It moved along. I can't remember the name of the group, Ecclesia something or other, that was established by Benedict to serve as the mediating body for this.
Ecclesiae was founded by John Paul II with Ratzinger as the key. Ratzinger was the key negotiator for John Paul II.
That's correct. That's what the various figures that were appointed to Ecclesiae were quite conservative, actually, in their own theological disposition. But perhaps that was the important point, to get people who would be not like-minded, but certainly open to some of the legitimate concerns of the society. But then, of course, we had the 2007 document, I think, from Pope Benedict, in which, once again, it was an effort to provide some kind of ironic way forward by creating the 2 rights. Although there would only be 1 right, there would be, for a period of time, an extraordinary right cohabiting with the ordinary right. It never really worked. Francis came in, issued his own document. He insists it was at the request of the Universal Episcopate. Now Leo is in the limelight, and he's in the limelight because the current head, what was his name anyway? David Pellerani, is moving to consecrate new bishops because they need to ordain more priests in the society. Are we facing schism, or is this just posturing, or is this just a minority voice of very little significance raising its, to mix my metaphor, raising its head in the ecclesial landscape? How do you read this? Should we be concerned about it? Dan?
So one name you did not mention in all of this, who was surprisingly friendly to the Society of St. Pius X, was Pope Francis. Right, of course. So Pope Francis famously had a very bad relationship with traditionalists who were within the kind of formal embrace of Catholicism in terms of their ministry, but in fact was fairly generous to the SSPX. He gave them faculties for confession, which in fact Benedict had not done, right? Consistent with the theme of mercy, right? That was central for Francis, but also a way of trying to reach out to marginalized Catholics. another hallmark of Francis's pontificate. He was trying, it was the field hospital, right? You're trying to patch up the wounds. But then, once you get out of the field hospital, right, you have to go and, go to physical therapy, right, and try to get well. And that's kind of where Leo is at, right? So we're now at a point where almost 40 years have passed since the last episcopal consecrations, right? So from a strategic perspective for the SSPX, you're at a point where, no matter what age the bishops were consecrated at, they are about ready to retire, right? And move on. And if they are going to move forward with the structure they've had, they need more bishops. And this obviously, once again, raises the point of what the relationship is with Rome. And what we've seen is they are unwilling to negotiate in good faith. Cardinal Fernandez arguably has been more than generous with them in terms of the kinds of discussions he's willing to have, but the red lines of like accepting the documents of Vatican II as written are simply too much. And ironically, in one of their responses, the SSPX said something that was unintentionally quite profound. And they said, essentially, you can't interpret the documents of Vatican II without the subsequent magisterium, right? So you can't interpret Nostra Aetate specifically without reading all the other documents of Catholic-Jewish dialogue, which go quite a bit further than Nostra Aetate was able to do because of the political circumstances, right? They even invoked documents like Amoris Laetitia, right, as receptions of Vatican II. So I think this is all mostly a coming to grips with the fact that the SSPX, which for all the attention it gets, is an exceedingly small group.
Yes, it is.
In terms of its cultural impact on Catholics. Its main impact, in fact, is on the message it sends to rogue traditionalist Catholics who are within the fold about how much they're able to get away with, right, in terms of not accepting Vatican II themselves. But I think we're getting to a parting of the ways where the SSPX is likely to become something like the Old Believers in Russia or something, a group that's just going to kind of carry on doing its own thing in a formal schism with, illicit but likely valid liturgies for quite a bit of time to come.
Yes, and there are other historical parallels, as you know. I mean, the old Catholic Church in Utrecht, the old Polish Catholic Church, breakaway churches that have maintained a minority status. They haven't entirely disappeared, but certainly their numbers are minuscule. And but the Society of St. Pius X seem to have got some energy, ironically, because I think you're quite right, Dan, and looking at Francis's record on this. They got it because of traditionalist hostility to Francis, who was perceived as insufficiently sympathetic to them. So now we have Leo, who's had no role to play in this cultural, ecclesiological war with his uniquely European genesis. He's been busy elsewhere. So now he's stuck with this on his plate. Do you think, this question is to Charlie as well, of course, do you think that's one of the reasons why he delegated it to Cardinal Fernandez to handle? Or is it because that's the appropriate direction to go? As Dan said earlier, John Paul II pretty well put Benedict in charge of that.
Yeah, no, I think to Dan's point, I think what we're seeing with the Society of St. Pius X is a fringe movement that gained a lot of traction because of traditionalist pushback to Pope Francis. That was a response to the fact that Benedict XVI aimed to have traditionalist liturgical practices during the reception of Vatican II be understood as part of communion with the Bishop of Rome, instead of having the Society of St. Pius X follow a pattern like what he did with the Ordinariate of Our Lady of Walsingham for Anglican liturgy in communion with the Bishop of Rome. Very, very significant that Pope Benedict created an ordinariate, a particular liturgical structure for some Catholics using a different rite under the Latin rite, but instead did the ordinary extraordinary logic for the whole church, which is, ironically, an Anglican move. But what Benedict did not do then is stop the formation of a kind of culture in the Society of St. Pius X that is functionally Protestant. And so my simple response to this is when there is an illicit consecration of a bishop, that's going to signal schism, and the deep irony is the radical traditionalists are going to be following Calvin's playbook. And I think that's an approach that might make sense, but to Dan's point, there's unexpected profundity. To interpret the Second Vatican Council understands it to be under the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and so the latter magisterium is necessary in how Catholics integrate what it means, particularly in the fact that there are some times with the Society of St. Pius X where I am wondering, is it liturgical aesthetics they're searching after, something to which I do have some sympathy for and perhaps we'll talk about, or is it because they don't like the development of doctrine? And if the latter point is true, this is a cosplaying of a history they don't have access to. It is not an authentic reception of a tradition in time, which is a tradition we know that goes back to the fathers.
I wonder, too, if it's not in part an anthropological as well as ecclesiological issue. By that, I mean, when the 2007 document came out, Summorum Pontificum, or whatever, I remember an analysis that came forward from the British Catholic press in which they were talking about a group of traditionalist Catholics, part of the Catholic traditional movement, whether they were politically aligned with the Society of St. Pius X, I don't think they were, but nonetheless they were sympathetic, of course. And they went to the canon of the cathedral in Cardiff, St. John's. That canon is now a British archbishop. And they went to them and they said, well, now we are entitled by law, because the Pope has made it clear, that we can have Mass according to our disposition, aesthetic, theological, whatever. And we would like our own chapel. And he said, of course, we can get side chapels here. And in fact, you can use the main chapel for these liturgies. We will work out the particular protocol, logistics and whatnot. And they said to the canon, oh, no, we don't want you to do it because you'll bring in altar girls. And so he said, so I see what you actually have in mind. So you, in fact, will not be celebrating Mass in this cathedral. Now, that seems to me a part of the point among the traditionalists, right? Whether they are aligned with the St. Pius X or otherwise, that it isn't just a matter of aesthetics. It isn't just a matter of saying you can only experience the transcendent if you use the Tridentine rite, however that's calibrated. It's more than that. It's a rejection not only of conciliar thinking, but it's also rejection of modern anthropology. And I wonder how much of that Leo sees as a threat to the integrity of the church, because now we're just talking about some canonical issues. Well, not just some, but canonical issues. And you know, I mean, if there's schism in the heart, there'll be schism in the reality come soon. And it is a minority expression. But it is an extreme minority expression of a rather not dominant, but strong view in the Catholic Church. And how Leo handles this is going to require incredible adroitness on his part. How do you see this moving forward with, I mean, we only have a few minutes left and we really need a whole half hour on this with regard to the liturgy or the altar wars. Will this exacerbate them, or will this lessen them somewhat because they'll be now seen as a kind of outside and particular occupation rather than integral to the communion of the church? How do you see this, Charlie, and then Dan?
I have a quick comment on this, and I'm excited to hear Dan's thoughts. I actually do think we're starting to see a continuity in Leo's actions, because what you just laid out, that wonderful story about Cardiff, Michael, points out that these decisions that appear ecclesial are also about a larger question about how we're understanding what it means to be church in the world. And that is precisely how Pope Leo addressed the leadership of the Neo-Catechumenal Way in Rome just a few weeks ago, which is to say, these movements, lay movements, ecclesial movements, regardless, if you're creating a subculture that is rupturing the unity of the church, that is using your stated ecclesial desire to justify the creation of an exclusive club. And I think Pope Leo is going to be quite clear in his Augustinian search for community that we have to wrestle with difficulties and differences in how we understand our response to God, but it can never be for the sake of a pleasurable set-apart community of the kind of things we like without any confrontation with that which we don't. Dan, what do you think about all this?
So, I mean, I want to comment quickly on Michael's point too. The coincidence of your point with the last couple of weekends, photos have circulated from masses that Leo has celebrated in Rome at parishes that use girl altar servers, right? And his being photographed with them. And I juxtaposed one of them with the headline of one of the best pieces that First Things published last year by our friend Jim Keating, which was a critique of a piece I wrote in Commonweal, and the headline was "Pope Leo, Catholic Boomer?" ? Right? Because for all intents and purposes, it looked like the bishop coming to your local normal parish and celebrating mass. I think where we're getting, and I want to bring up that piece I wrote in Commonweal because I think it points to what I said there. Which is that with Leo as somebody who entered religious life and was ordained well after Vatican II, we are getting to a point where the fighting over Vatican II as a reality is over. So the fact is there can be room for some legitimate ritual diversity within the church, right? Just as historically, right? The church accommodated various local kinds of rites and everything, but there is not room for diversity of whether to accept the basic tenets of an ecumenical council and whether to accept communion, right? Because some of the issues that the SSPX highlights are rife within the religious orders that are within the church that exclusively celebrate the 1962 Missal, and in many cases refuse to celebrate the Chrism Mass, to concelebrate the Chrism Mass with their local bishop in the ordinary form, right? These are things that need to be dealt with. And the way of dealing with the SSPX is a signal to those groups that the SSPX cannot function as their ideal. If the SSPX is going to function as their ideal, then they ought to join. But that, again, there can be some ritual diversity, but that has to be within communion, or else it's false diversity, right? Or else it's really, you're doing something different. As Charlie said, you are exercising a Protestant ecclesiology, right? With which we can have ecumenical dialogue, but that's different than full communion.
That's right. One is the ad extra versus the ad extra, right? Yeah. Okay, gentlemen, wonderful time engaging as always. Issues that come up that we'll be following through with subsequent conversations on Cor Ecclesiae. See you in a couple of weeks. Take care.